What if everything you learned about the history of human sexuality was incomplete? What if the textbooks, the curricula, and the documentaries you grew up with left out entire civilizations, entire centuries, entire categories of human experience, not by accident, but by design? What if the story of love, gender, and identity across human history was far richer, far stranger, and far more inclusive than anyone ever told you? That is not a rhetorical question. That is the actual historical record. And today, we are going to read it together. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. How are you doing today? Truly, how are you feeling? If you are watching this, you probably have a curious mind and a genuine hunger for history that goes beyond the surface. That means a lot. This channel exists because of people like you. And every single view, every comment, every moment you spend here matters more than you know. Today, we are going to go somewhere that most history classes never go. We are going to look at civilizations across thousands of years and ask a very honest question. What did they actually think about gender and sexuality? Not what we assume they thought. Not what we wish they thought. What the historical record actually tells us. So settle in. This one is going to be a journey. If you find this kind of deep historical storytelling interesting, go ahead and hit the like button right now. It takes 2 seconds, and it genuinely helps this channel reach more people who care about history as much as you do. Let us begin with a framing that most educators avoid. We tend to assume, often without realizing it, that heterosexuality and binary gender are the historical default. We treat them as the ancient norm, from which everything else is a modern deviation. We assume that ancient people were essentially like us, maybe more repressed, maybe more rigid, but operating within the same basic categories we use today. That assumption is wrong. It is not even close to being right. And the evidence against it does not come from fringe scholars or political advocates. It comes from tombs, temples, legal codes, poetry, court records, and religious texts spanning multiple continents and several thousand years of recorded human civilization. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what was erased, not just ignored, not just forgotten, deliberately, systematically, and often violently erased. We will get to that part. But first, we need to understand what was there before the erasure began. Let us start in ancient Greece, because it is the civilization most people invoke first when this subject comes up. And the invoking is justified, but the understanding is usually incomplete. The ancient Greeks did not have our modern categories of gay, straight, or bisexual. They operated within entirely different frameworks of meaning. In classical Athens, the most thoroughly documented form of male-male intimacy was the relationship between an adult man and an adolescent boy. The older partner was called the erastes. The younger was the eromenos. This relationship was not merely tolerated. In certain philosophical circles, it was considered the highest form of human connection. Socrates himself argued that love between men was more noble than heterosexual love precisely because it was driven by the soul rather than physical desire alone. That argument was made publicly, recorded in writing, and treated as serious philosophy. The Spartans took the principle even further. Their warrior culture was built in part on male bonds so deep that shame before a beloved was considered a more powerful motivator than fear of death. A soldier would fight harder beside the man he loved than beside a stranger. This was not a side note to Spartan military culture. It was a pillar of it. The Sacred Band of Thebes, an elite military unit composed entirely of male couples, was considered unbeatable for exactly this reason. They fought as one because they lived as one. They were destroyed at the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BCE, and even their conquerors reportedly wept over them. But here is where intellectual honesty requires a pause. The Greek framework was not simply a more permissive version of modern sexual identity. It was wrapped in ideas about age, status, and social role. The older partner was not considered less masculine. The younger partner was not considered feminine. What mattered was not the gender of your partner, but your position within a hierarchy of status and power. Modern historians debate whether we should even use the word gay to describe these relationships, because doing so projects our own categories backward onto a society that thought about these things in fundamentally different terms. That debate is ongoing. It is not resolved. And honest engagement with history requires us to sit with that complexity rather than flatten it. What about women in ancient Greece? Here, the most famous figure is Sappho, a poet from the island of Lesbos, writing in the 7th century BCE. Her surviving work speaks of desire for other women with a directness and urgency that requires no interpretation. She ran a school for young women on her island, and the bonds formed there were described by her and by others in terms that were clearly emotional and physical. She was celebrated in her own time. She was called the 10th Muse, and the verses she left behind represent some of the most emotionally honest love poetry in all of classical literature. The documentation for female same-sex relationships in ancient Greece is thinner than for male relationships, but Sappho alone is enough to establish that this history existed, was visible, and was considered worthy of the highest artistic form. From Greece, we move to Rome, and Rome is where the scale becomes almost impossible to comprehend. The Roman Empire stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia. It absorbed dozens of cultures, traditions, and peoples. And across that vast empire, the official attitude towards sexuality was, to put it plainly, not particularly concerned with the gender of your partner. What mattered in Rome was hierarchy. What mattered was status. The question was not whether you loved a man or a woman. The question was who was dominant and who was not. Emperor Hadrian's relationship with a young Greek man named Antinous is one of the most thoroughly documented same-sex relationships in the ancient world. When Antinous died young in mysterious circumstances, Hadrian's grief was extraordinary. He deified Antinous, built a city in his name, had temples erected to his memory across the empire, and minted coins with his image. This was not a private mourning. It was an imperial act of public devotion. The cult of Antinous persisted for generations after Hadrian's death. People worshipped at temples dedicated to his memory. This relationship was not hidden. It was celebrated at the highest levels of Roman civilization. And yet the Roman framework, like the Greek one, cannot simply be mapped onto modern identity. Roman citizens were expected to be the dominant party in any sexual encounter. To be the receptive partner as a free adult citizen was considered degrading because it placed you in the role reserved for women, slaves, and social inferiors. It was not the gender of the encounter that carried moral weight. It was the power dynamic within it. Emperor Nero was criticized not for having relationships with men, but for reportedly taking the subordinate role, which to Roman minds was beneath the dignity of an emperor. The Roman sources treat this as evidence of weakness and degradation, not of any particular sexual category. Here is a question worth sitting with for a moment. If a society accepts same-sex relationships, but only on the condition that one person must dominate and the other must submit, what does that tell us about how that society understands power? Is acceptance without equality really acceptance? Think about that and feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. There is no simple answer, and that is exactly why it is worth asking. Now, let us travel further back. Ancient Egypt gives us what may be the earliest documented same-sex relationship in recorded history. The tomb of Khnumhotep and Nianchchnum, who served in the royal palace during the 5th dynasty around 2400 BCE, shows the two men depicted in positions of intimacy reserved in Egyptian art for romantic couples. Their noses touch in the classic Egyptian gesture of affection. They are shown embracing. Their tomb identifies them as joint officials beloved of the king, and they were buried together in a shared tomb, which in ancient Egypt was an honor, not a concession. Their relationship was not hidden in the margins of their civilization. It was carved into stone and presented to eternity. Later, Egyptian texts also reference same-sex relationships without apparent moral judgment. The evidence suggests that ancient Egypt simply did not treat same-sex love as a category requiring special condemnation or special celebration. It was part of the landscape of human experience. Historians debate the full meaning of this, and they are honest about the limits of the evidence. But what we know is enough to establish that this was not invisible and was not treated as shameful. Mesopotamia offers us something even more striking. Not just the acceptance of same-sex love, but the formal religious recognition of what we might today call a third gender. The Sumerian and Akkadian civilizations of ancient Iraq and Syria developed a category of sacred individuals who existed outside the caste, male-female binary, and who held recognized roles in their religious systems. The gala priests served the goddess Inanna Ishtar and were described as neither fully male nor fully female in the conventional sense. They adopted feminine dress, performed feminine ritual roles, and were considered to possess special spiritual powers precisely because they existed between categories. One individual who had held such a role was documented to have later become king of a gender-nonconforming sacred priest who rose to the highest political office in his civilization. That is not a footnote. That is a headline. The Mesopotamian understanding was fundamentally different from the Western binary we inherit today. They saw gender as something that certain sacred individuals could transcend for spiritual purposes. The gala priests were not considered degraded or morally suspect. They were considered holy. This concept, the idea that gender diversity carries spiritual significance rather than moral failure, appears repeatedly across cultures that had no contact with each other. That pattern deserves more attention than it usually gets. Let us now cross the Atlantic. Because the indigenous peoples of the Americas had rich and varied traditions around gender that were systematically destroyed by colonization. The modern umbrella term Two-Spirit was created in 1990 as a pan-indigenous way of describing the many gender-diverse roles that existed across hundreds of distinct North American nations. But that term encompasses enormous diversity, and no single description does justice to all of it. Among the Navajo, the Nadli combined male and female spiritual elements and were recognized as a distinct and honored category. Among the Lakota, the Winkte held ceremonial roles and were respected as a separate gender. The Mojave recognized two separate categories for individuals born as either sex who lived as the other gender. The Zuni had an individual known to history as Wewa, a person assigned male at birth who lived as a woman, was a highly respected artist and spiritual leader, and who met with President Grover Cleveland in 1886 as a representative of the Zuni people. The president had no idea he was speaking with someone his own culture would have classified differently from how Zuni society did. The pattern across these nations was not one of grudging tolerance. Two-spirit individuals were often healers, mediators, spiritual leaders, and artists. Their role was not marginal. It was essential to the functioning of their societies. And this was true across hundreds of distinct cultures on multiple continents that developed these traditions independently, without contact with each other. What does it mean when so many different human societies arrived at similar understandings through entirely different paths? That is a question worth carrying with you. Let us pause here for a moment and ask you directly. If you had grown up in a society where gender diversity was considered spiritually significant rather than morally problematic, how do you think your understanding of yourself and others would be different? Leave your thoughts in the comments. There is no correct answer. But the question itself reveals a lot about the assumptions embedded in the world we inherit. Now we turn to South Asia and the Mughal Empire, which presents a remarkable and historically honest complication. The Mughals were Muslim rulers, and Islam has had complex and often restrictive official positions on same-sex acts. And yet the Mughal court produced some of the most openly celebratory documentation of same-sex love in pre-colonial history. Emperor Akbar, who ruled from 1556 to 1605, had male lovers, and this was not a secret. His court poets celebrated it in verses performed publicly. His son Jahangir was even more explicit, documenting his own attraction to men in his own autobiography. The Jahangirnama, a royal memoir, contains passages describing the emperor's response to a beautiful young man with a candor that has no parallel in the official documents of most royal courts. Shah Jahan, who built the Taj Mahal in memory of his beloved wife, also had documented male lovers. And the Persian and Urdu literary traditions that flourished under the Mughals contain thousands of poems that treat love between men as fully equal in worth and beauty to any other form of love. What does this tell us? It tells us that official religious doctrine and lived cultural practice are not always the same thing. It tells us that human beings, even within frameworks of religious restriction, find ways to honor the full range of their experience. And it tells us that the history of these traditions is complicated and resistant to simple narratives, whether those narratives come from advocates or from critics. Ancient Japan offers yet another framework entirely. The concept of wakashu described young male apprentices who occupied a recognized category between adult men and women. The relationships between adult men and wakashu were documented, accepted, and produced their own aesthetic traditions, literature, and social norms. Onagata actors performed as women on stage, and their role extended far beyond performance. They were considered masters of a certain kind of beauty and were sought out as companions by aristocratic men. None of this carried moral stigma within traditional Japanese culture. Buddhism and Shinto did not treat male-male love as inherently sinful or unnatural. The acceptance was genuine and lasted for centuries. What ended it? Western modernity. In 1872, the Meiji government criminalized same-sex acts as part of a deliberate effort to appear civilized by the standards of Western powers. Japan suppressed its own traditions, not because those traditions were condemned by its own culture, but because it needed to look modern and acceptable to the Europeans who were reshaping the world around it. That is not the restoration of a natural order. That is the imposition of a foreign one. In Polynesia, the tradition of the mahu in Hawaii and the whāwhāin in Samoa represent some of the most thoroughly documented examples of gender diversity in any pre-colonial society. The mahu held roles in healing, religious ceremony, and craft. Hawaiian society understood gender as existing on a spectrum, and mahu were not marginal figures. They were integral ones. The whāwhāin of Samoa were assigned male at birth and lived as women. They were associated with women's work and craft, and were considered a normal and valued part of Samoan social life. Not a curiosity, not an aberration, a recognized category of human being with specific roles and specific value. Captain James Cook documented the presence of mahu in Tahiti in the 18th century. Other European explorers made similar observations across the Pacific. And then the missionaries arrived. Here is the part of the history that is hardest to look at directly, but most important to understand. The erasure of all these traditions was not an accident. It was not the gradual fading of outdated practices. It was a deliberate, organized campaign carried out by colonial governments and Christian missionaries who had the power to enforce their theology through law, education, and violence. In the Americas, boarding schools were specifically designed to strip indigenous children of their identities. including their understanding of gender diversity. Children were taken from their families, punished for any expression of gender nonconformity, and taught to view their own traditions as sinful and shameful. The trauma of that suppression is still felt in indigenous communities today. In India, British colonial law imposed legal penalties against same-sex acts that remained in place until 2018, not until 2018. In Africa, the same pattern played out. Same-sex relationships existed across multiple African cultures before colonialism. Colonial legal codes criminalized them. Many of those laws remain on the books today, held up as African tradition by governments that are actually enforcing European imperial theology. In Japan, as we discussed, the suppression came from the government's own desire to appear modern. In Polynesia, missionaries targeted the mahu and the fa'afafine directly, using the term mahu itself as a slur to replace its original meaning. The result of all this is a profound historical amnesia. Most people genuinely do not know this history. When they encounter it, it sounds radical. It sounds invented. But it is not invented. It is simply the history that colonial educational systems chose not to teach, because teaching it would complicate the narrative that European social norms were the default of human civilization and that everything else was deviation. Let us be analytically precise about what happened. The colonial project required a certain story about history. It required the belief that European civilization represented the peak of human development and that the practices of colonized peoples were primitive, immoral, or both. A history that showed complex, sophisticated, and diverse traditions of gender and sexuality across pre-colonial civilizations would have undermined that story. So that history was omitted. Scholars who mentioned it were marginalized. Sources that documented it were reinterpreted, mistranslated, or simply ignored. This was not a passive forgetting. It was an active suppression, sustained over generations, with real consequences for real people. And here is the analytical question that history forces us to ask. When a civilization builds legal and religious infrastructure, specifically to destroy the traditions of the peoples it conquers, what does that tell us about the relationship between power and history? Who decides what is natural? Who decides what is traditional? Who decides what the record says? The answer, almost always, is whoever has the power to enforce those decisions. That has always been true. It is true today. What the historical record actually shows, when you read it fully and honestly, is not universal tolerance. It is not a pre-colonial paradise, free of hierarchy and cruelty. The civilizations we discussed had their own inequalities, their own systems of dominance, their own forms of cruelty. No civilization is a paradise. But what the record does show is that human societies, across thousands of years and multiple continents, consistently found ways to account for the reality of human diversity in gender and sexuality. They built religious roles, social categories, legal accommodations, and literary traditions around that reality. They did this because human diversity existed, and they needed frameworks to understand it. The idea that heterosexuality and binary gender are the historical norm from which everything else is a modern deviation is not a conclusion supported by the historical record. It is a narrative imposed by a specific historical moment for specific political and theological purposes, with specific beneficiaries and specific victims. History does not support the simplification. It never has. What does all of this mean for us today? The civilizations we discussed are not simply curiosities from a distant past. They are evidence of the full range of what human societies are capable of building. When we erase that history, we erase not just the past, but the possibilities it represents. When we recover it, we recover not just knowledge, but a kind of permission. The permission that comes from knowing that the world has been larger and more complex than the stories we were handed. There is a line that runs from the gala priests of ancient Mesopotamia to the two-spirit people of the Navajo Nation to the mahu of Hawaii to the poets of the Mughal court, and it runs all the way to the present. That line is not a straight one. It curves and breaks and is interrupted by centuries of suppression. But it does not disappear. History has a way of surviving the people who want to erase it. The sources are still there. The tombs are still there. The poems are still there. And people are still reading them. The question is not whether this history existed. The question is what we choose to do with it, how we teach it, how we tell it, whether we are willing to hold the full complexity of what human civilization has been, including the parts that were suppressed and the parts that are still being recovered. History is not a finished document. It is an ongoing argument about who we are and what we have been. That argument is still happening in courts and classrooms and conversations happening right now all over the world. And knowing that it is an argument, knowing that the version you were taught was not the only version, knowing that the story is bigger and stranger and richer than you were led to believe, that is not the end of something. That is the beginning. If this conversation made you think, if it challenged something you assumed, if it gave you a piece of history you had never encountered before, then please hit the like button and share this video with someone who loves history. That support is what makes this channel possible. Subscribe if you have not already, and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. We are just getting started. History has never been as simple as the people in power wanted it to be. It rarely is. And perhaps that is the most important thing it has to teach us.